At 9:42 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time this morning, the Australian Minister for Resources, the Honourable David Carmichael, walked into a scheduled briefing room inside the Department of Industry complex in Canberra. Sitting across the table were senior representatives from 3 American corporations, 2 of the largest lithium mining companies operating in the Western world, and 1 major defence-affiliated rare earth processing firm. The meeting had been arranged 6 weeks earlier, under the assumption that a long-term supply framework was close to being finalised. It was not. By 11:15 a.m. Eastern Time in Washington, the United States Department of Commerce released a statement confirming that talks between American industry representatives and the Australian federal government had collapsed without agreement. The statement described the breakdown as unexpected and deeply concerning. It offered no further explanation, but inside Canberra, the explanation was already being prepared for public release. And what it contained would trigger one of the most significant geopolitical shockwaves the global minerals market had seen in years. The background to this moment stretched back nearly 4 months. Since late the previous year, the United States government had been applying sustained pressure on Australia to formalise what American officials described as a trusted partner minerals framework. Under this framework, Australian producers of lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements and manganese would be required to submit production forecasts, export volumes, and pricing data directly to a joint US-Australian oversight committee with significant American representation. Any sale of designated strategic minerals above a threshold volume to a country outside the approved buyer list would require prior authorization from that committee. On its surface, the framework was presented as a security measure, a way to ensure that critical materials essential for American defense and technology manufacturing did not end up flowing toward adversarial nations through indirect channels. But the details embedded inside the framework told a different story. According to documents reviewed by Australian government analysts, the Oversight Committee structure would effectively give American representatives veto authority over a substantial portion of Australia's mineral export decisions. The approved buyer list was controlled by Washington and could be updated unilaterally. Australia would have consultation rights, but no binding power to override American objections. Pricing transparency requirements would expose sensitive commercial data from Australian mining companies to American government review, creating what industry representatives privately described as a structural competitive disadvantage. And then there were the exit terms. If Australia chose to leave the framework before a 10-year minimum commitment period expired, it would be required to repay all economic benefits received during participation, including tariff reductions, technology transfer agreements, and intelligence cooperation enhancements. Those repayment obligations were estimated by independent analysts to potentially reach as high as $180 billion, depending on how long the arrangement had been in place. In other words, the framework was designed to be nearly impossible to exit once entered. The Australian government had spent weeks conducting internal analysis of the proposal. Treasury officials modelled the long-term revenue implications. Defence advisors assessed the sovereignty implications of the oversight structure. Legal experts examined the exit terms. Trade economists calculated the opportunity cost of restricting Australia's buyer pool to an American-approved list. The conclusions were consistent across every department. The framework would deliver short-term diplomatic and economic benefits, but would progressively erode Australia's ability to independently manage its most valuable strategic assets over the following decade. The moment that analysis was complete, the cabinet decision was effectively already made. What happened at 9:42 a.m. in that Canberra briefing room was not a negotiation. It was a notification. Minister Carmichael informed the American representatives that the Australian government would not be entering the Trusted Partner Minerals framework. The meeting lasted 31 minutes. The Americans were given a formal written statement of the government's position. They were thanked for their engagement, and then the meeting ended. Less than 3 hours later, the consequences began to unfold. At precisely 1:08 p.m. local time in Canberra, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese appeared before cameras in the main hall of Parliament House. Standing beside him were the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Resources, and the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. The configuration itself sent a signal. This was not a routine press statement. This was a coordinated policy declaration. Albanese began by confirming what markets had already begun to suspect. Australia had declined to join the United States' proposed Trusted Partner Minerals framework. The decision, he said, had been reached after thorough analysis by every relevant arm of the federal government and after extensive consultation with Australia's mining industry, its trade partners, and its legal and strategic advisors. He then explained the reasoning in methodical detail. The framework, he said, would have placed Australian mineral exports under a governance structure that was not jointly controlled in any meaningful sense. The Oversight Committee design gave American representatives authority to block or delay export decisions affecting resources that were Australian sovereign assets. That arrangement was incompatible with the principle that Australia's natural resources are managed by and for the Australian people through their elected government, not through committees whose composition and decision-making power could be shaped by a foreign administration. He addressed the financial implications directly. According to Treasury modelling, the pricing transparency requirements and approved buyer list restrictions embedded in the framework would reduce Australia's achievable mineral export revenue by an estimated $290 billion over the 10-year commitment period, compared to operating under open market conditions. That gap represented the difference between selling into a restricted pool of approved buyers and selling competitively to the full range of qualified international purchasers. That revenue, he noted, belonged to Australian citizens and Australian public finances. It was not available to be transferred to foreign industrial interests through structural pricing disadvantages. He then addressed the exit terms. No sovereign government, he said, should sign an economic agreement containing exit penalties equivalent to a significant fraction of national economic output. Agreements between allies should be structured so that either party can leave if circumstances change, or if the arrangement proves contrary to national interest. Exit penalties of the scale contained in this framework were not the architecture of a partnership. They were the architecture of a binding obligation from which departure would be economically catastrophic. Australia had not and would not sign agreements of that design. Then came the statement that stopped trading floors across 3 continents. Albanese announced that Australia was simultaneously releasing a new national minerals partnership policy that would govern all future long-term supply agreements with foreign governments and companies. Under the new policy, Australia would actively pursue commercial supply contracts with multiple international partners. All agreements would be based on competitive market pricing. No single buyer or group of buyers would be granted exclusive or near-exclusive access to Australian production. No foreign government or government-affiliated body would hold oversight authority over Australian export decisions. The policy, he said, reflected a straightforward recognition. Australia's mineral reserves were among the most strategically valuable assets on Earth. Lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, nickel and manganese were not peripheral commodities. They were the foundational inputs for electric vehicle batteries, advanced radar systems, missile guidance technology, semiconductor manufacturing, and next-generation energy infrastructure. The countries and companies that secured reliable access to those materials at competitive prices would have structural advantages in every major technology sector for the next 30 years. Australia, he concluded, intended to manage those assets accordingly, not as a captive supplier to any single power, but as a sovereign nation conducting competitive, transparent, and commercially rational trade with the world. The reaction was instantaneous and enormous. Lithium carbonate futures jumped 19% in the first hour of trading following the announcement, moving from approximately $15,200 per metric ton to just above $18,100. Market analysts noted that the scale and speed of the move reflected not just a single news event, but a fundamental repricing of supply risk. Traders across Asia and Europe recalculated their assumptions about where Australian lithium would flow and at what price, and those calculations produced a consensus that global competition for the material had just become significantly more intense. Rare earth markets moved even more dramatically. Neodymium prices surged approximately 34% in early trading. Dysprosium, a heavy rare earth element with critical applications in high-temperature permanent magnets used in jet engine components and precision missile systems, gained nearly 28%. Terbium climbed by more than 31%. The rare earth complex as a whole posted its largest single-session move in more than 2 years, as investors recognized that supply chains, which had been partially structured around assumed preferential access to Australian production, now faced an entirely different competitive environment. Cobalt futures rose approximately 11%. Nickel gained 16%. Manganese advanced nearly 10%. The currency impact was equally clear. The Australian dollar strengthened sharply against the US dollar, the euro, and the Japanese yen, as foreign exchange traders assessed the implications of Australia positioning itself as a competitive supplier to the entire world, rather than a preferential supplier to a single bloc. Mining company share prices reflected the same logic. BHP surged. Rio Tinto advanced strongly. Pilbara Minerals recorded one of the largest single-day gains in its listed history. Lynas Rare Earths climbed sharply, as analysts highlighted its unique position as one of the only major rare earth processing operations outside Chinese control, now positioned to benefit from intensifying global demand from buyers who could no longer assume structured access to Australian supply. American defense industry stocks moved in the opposite direction. Lockheed Martin fell as analysts warned that higher rare earth prices would increase production costs for multiple advanced weapons platforms. Raytheon Technologies declined as markets recalculated the material cost assumptions underlying several major missile programs. Northrop Grumman also slipped, as investors assessed exposure to supply chain cost increases across radar and electronic warfare systems that depend heavily on high-performance rare earth components. Tesla shares dropped in pre-market trading as analysts flagged the implications for battery material costs. General Motors declined. Ford Motor Company also fell as investors reassessed the cost trajectory for electric vehicle programs that had been partially structured around expectations of competitively priced lithium from Australian sources. Behind the market movements was a geopolitical calculation that defence planners in multiple capitals were already working through. Australia produces approximately 47% of the world's lithium. It is the source of a substantial share of global cobalt and nickel exports. Its rare earth reserves, while not the largest in absolute terms, are among the most accessible and politically stable in the world. When combined with Australia's established trade relationships, its legal and regulatory environment, and its geographic position between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, those reserves gave the country an extraordinary degree of leverage in the emerging global competition for strategic materials. The Australian government's announcement that it would now pursue that leverage through competitive commercial diplomacy rather than exclusive partnership with a single power changed the strategic calculus for every major industrial and military economy on Earth. Within hours of the Canberra announcement, diplomatic activity across multiple capitals accelerated sharply. Japanese Trade Ministry officials issued a public statement welcoming Australia's new minerals partnership policy and confirming Japan's interest in expanding long-term supply agreements. South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy released a similar statement. Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs confirmed that discussions with Australian counterparts regarding critical mineral supply chains were already underway and would be intensified. India's Ministry of Mines issued a brief statement describing Australia as a natural and valued partner in securing the mineral inputs essential for India's industrial development program. Canada, whose own critical minerals sector was watching Australian policy closely, saw its own mining sector stocks climb as markets anticipated increased global attention to all stable democratic mineral-producing nations. In Brussels, European Commission officials confirmed they were monitoring the situation and that the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act framework created a clear mechanism for pursuing formal supply partnerships with Australia. The full picture that emerged across that single afternoon was of a world in which the assumption of structured, preferential access to Australian minerals had just been formally dissolved and replaced by something far more competitive, far less predictable, and far more consequential for the industrial and military planning of every major power. For the United States, the path forward was complicated. American policymakers now faced a choice between three imperfect options. The first was to engage with Australia's new competitive framework, pursue commercial supply agreements at open market prices, and accept that American manufacturers would pay the same rates as their competitors in Asia and Europe. That path preserved access to the materials, but removed the pricing advantages that American industrial planners had been counting on. The second option was to accelerate domestic mining and processing development within the United States. The Defense Production Act contained provisions that could be invoked to support this effort. But building new mines and refining facilities takes years under the best circumstances and faces significant environmental, regulatory, and technical obstacles. Domestic rare earth processing capacity in particular remained far below what would be required to substitute for imported materials. The third option was to deepen mineral partnerships with other producing nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Those regions contain significant reserves, but supply chains built through those channels would face their own political risks, infrastructure limitations, and long development timelines. None of the three options was quick, none was cheap, and none eliminated the fundamental reality that modern defense and technology manufacturing depended on a complex global supply web that could not be instantly replaced or restructured. For Australia, the challenge ahead was different, but equally demanding. Managing enormous mineral wealth in a competitive geopolitical environment required balancing opportunity against stability. Maximizing export revenue while maintaining productive relationships with multiple major powers. Building domestic processing and refining capacity to capture more value from raw materials rather than simply exporting them in unprocessed form. And navigating the attention of every major industrial economy on Earth without becoming so entangled in the strategic interests of any single one of them that independence was gradually surrendered through accumulation rather than through any single explicit agreement. What Albanese announced from Parliament House was not an end to Australia's relationship with the United States. Both governments moved quickly to emphasise that the security alliance remained intact, that intelligence cooperation continued, and that the bilateral relationship extended far beyond any single trade framework. But it was an unmistakable declaration that Australia would manage its sovereign resources on its own terms, that the era of assumed preferential access was over, and that the global race to secure the minerals that power modern civilization had entered a new and far more contested phase. The world heard the message clearly, and the world began adjusting immediately.